It's a huge honor to be back here. As I was walking in, I was just reflecting how many times I've been sitting in those seats and watching someone stand here. So it's exciting for me to be here and share the story of how I built Celmatix. Let's see here. So I started the first year of my PhD in 2001, which was also the year that the first almost full human genome sequence was announced. And we hear a lot about how millennials, and I'll get to that in a little bit, are technology natives. And I really consider myself a genomics native. As a scientist, it's always been part of my scientific career. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how I was really on the front lines of watching how this amazing way of thinking about science and thinking about healthcare really was influencing the field of medicine around me, and then ultimately inspired me to found Celmatix. So before we had the benefit of genomics in our lives, I wanted to walk you through the cancer world and how it was impacted by this, because it was really one of the first fields of medicine to be impacted by genomics in a significant way. So in what I refer to as a pre-genomic era, the hereditary nature of cancer was still really a black box. It wasn't clear why certain families seemed to be predisposed to cancer. It wasn't clear why certain individuals within families, so one sister may get breast cancer, another may not, and it wasn't well understood why. The broader risk factors also weren't understood. We didn't have large data sets. We didn't have a lot of the correlations that we now have about environmental risk and other types of risk factors. And then hand in hand with the hereditary components of cancer and the broader risk factors being a black box, the interventions were also pretty limited. So you had a pretty big hammer in the form of radiation or chemotherapy that you would use to target cell growth generally. And the challenge with targeting cell growth with such a large hammer is that there were a lot of off-target effects, a lot of collateral damage, because there are a lot of cells that grow. And there was also surgical excision of out-of-control growth, which ended up harming a lot of healthy tissue as well. And in the post-genomic era, once we were able to really go subclinically below the surface of this disease and understand on a genetic level what made one tumor different than another, or what made one family different than another, or an individual in a family different than perhaps a sibling, that black box opened up. And what was amazing, and this was really the early days of my PhD work here at Weill Cornell, was to see how those genetic level insights into what the drivers of cancer were translated into targeted interventions where we could move away from such a big hammer and really move further down those signaling pathways molecularly and target the specific disease, and then identify the people whose tumors would benefit from those targeted interventions. So this is all, I see a lot of nodding heads. This is obvious now. It's standard of care. The FDA requires companion diagnostics for targeted interventions in oncology now. But my first year of grad school, this was not a done deal. And that wasn't that long ago, so it's really moved really fast. If we compare and contrast reproductive health and women's health more broadly outside of oncology, unfortunately, effectively, we're still in the pre-genomic, or I'm going to show you now, thanks to some of the work that we and colleagues have done in the early post-genomic era. It still isn't clear why some people are predisposed to reproductive conditions or non-oncology women's health conditions. And it's also not clear what you can do about it. So the interventions are very limited. The toolbox is very limited. And again, they're very large hammers. You take estrogen away, you put estrogen back, you misregulate estrogen, biggest hammer possible. And then also, when that's not successful, you go in and you surgically remove parts of a woman's body. And for me, the aha moment that I had during my postdoctoral work in Cambridge in the UK after I had graduated was because my career had shifted from an academic standpoint from oncology and really being on the front lines of precision medicine here at Sloan Kettering and Cornell, and had switched to reproductive health. And when I made that shift, what I realized is I didn't see those transformative insights and technologies coming to reproductive health or to women's health more broadly. And so the real light bulb moment was that we needed to do better for women. Women deserved better tools, better options, more personalized care outside of oncology. And so with that flight of insanity or brilliance, time will tell. It's trending more towards brilliance and insanity these days, which is good. But I moved back from the UK, back to New York City, and really bootstrapped. So I came back to New York because my network was here. Cornell was our first collaborator. One of my PhD mentors was still here. Took a bet on a concept, on an idea, and so I got started. Celmatix was founded in a living room in Tribeca. My graduate school roommate and I Laura Bandak, and I decided to start the company together. And so what did we do after we had that light bulb moment and decided we're going to try to really catalyze precision medicine in women's health and do something that, in retrospect, was pretty crazy? Well, the first thing is that technology innovation, the life cycles are long. So it can take 10, 15 years to really move a field forward. So one of the things that we needed to understand was not how we could impact the lives of women our own age, but millennial women. So how many of you guys were born after 1980? Okay, great. So I didn't say it, we just copy and paste it. So we hear a lot about millennials. Why are you guys so special? Well, you're special for many reasons, but one of the reasons that you're so special is because you're the largest generation in the history of humanity. So it turns out that your attitudes about things, the decisions that you're making about reproductive health really impact the fate of the species. And so, no pressure. No pressure. So you're technology natives, we know this. And so one of the things that we've done at Celmatix over the years is we call it our Nextgen Women project, where we have really gone out, we've interviewed or surveyed thousands of millennial women around the country to try to understand how this technology native generation is approaching their reproductive health. And apologies to the men in the audience, we should survey you guys too, but women's health company, so we started there. So first of all, much like the generations before, millennial mothers or millennial women want to be mothers. Many of them want to have more than one child. But unlike any generation before, most of them want to wait until after 30 to start their families. And 1 in 5 want to wait until after 35. And when I say this to a room of reproductive endocrinologists, there's a gasp in the room when I share this statistic, because as many of you know, and if you don't know, I'm about to share the bad news with you, that we didn't evolve for this kind of demographic shift. And so this is a huge experiment that we're doing with our genome in a single generation. So the other thing we learned is that millennials, and this is, I think, very keeping with the fact that you're comfortable with technology in general, embrace reproductive technologies as well. And the majority of them would consider IVF. The majority of them are thinking about egg freezing. And interestingly, bringing it back to the precision medicine vision, 4 out of 5 of the women who we surveyed said that they specifically wanted to understand how their genetics might impact their fertility down the road. So that was great. So the good news was that this generation was at least open to using technology. So what was the challenge in actually delivering this technology to this generation of women to give them this clarity so they could really make the right decisions? Well, the challenge is that there are huge disparities in funding between oncology and reproductive health. And what I've plotted here in blue is a study we did a few years ago where we looked at the evidence base for clinical genetics publications in cancer versus in fertility. And you can see that it's pretty dismal. So what do we mean by reproductive condition? So one example of a reproductive condition is endometriosis. Endometriosis, I've shown you some of the symptoms for those of you who have not heard of it. It impacts between 10 and possibly up to 20% of all women in the world. That's over 176 million women around the world are impacted by endometriosis. It's a chronic pain condition, often tied to a menstrual cycle. And importantly, half of women with endometriosis will likely experience some difficulty conceiving. So when we actually look at how much the NIH invests in endometriosis research, what we can see is that they, in 2016, spent $10 million. That's how much money went into endometriosis research. Polycystic ovary syndrome, which is another big driver of infertility, got a little bit more, got 18 million. In the same year, anthrax, which impacted 0 Americans, got $51 million of funding. And if we compare it to diabetes, diabetes got $1 billion of government funding for research in the same year. So half as many humans in the United States are impacted by endometriosis as diabetes, and yet it gets a fraction of the funding. So that was one of the challenges. So I get asked a lot when I share these statistics, why is that? Why don't we fund women's health conditions? Well, I have an opinion. I think it's because we don't talk about it. I think it's still very taboo. So the other thing that came out of our study of millennial women was that even though they are very comfortable embracing the concept of using technology, they're still not talking about that. Even though the majority of them are concerned about whether they're going to have trouble conceiving because there's a growing awareness of fertility and fertility decline, they're still not talking about it. They're not talking about it with their friends. They're not talking about it with their doctors. So one of the things that we did earlier this year is we launched a campaign called Say the F Word for fertility. And it's the other F word. And it was great. We started a conversation, and thousands of women hashtagged, shared videos, shared their thoughts and concerns. And I shared the story of my own pregnancy loss. One of the things that we found was that half of women don't talk about pregnancy losses with their friends, and in fact, 1 in 4 don't even tell their male partners that they experienced a miscarriage. So we were shocked, and so it's one of the reasons that we started this campaign. And I say this as a sidebar to the building the story, the company story, because often when you're an entrepreneur, you're an innovator, you find yourself suddenly needing to sidebar and address some of the bigger, more kind of macro issues, even though you may be laser focused on the innovative edge, and so be prepared for that. But specifically in building a company, what did we need to do? So that was the opportunity. Those were the challenges. What did we need to do? Well, the first thing is we needed to build the foundational data assets in our field, in the private sector, because there was no money in the public sector to do this. So over years, we have built what we call the Personalized Reproductive Medicine Initiative. It has brought together some of the leading academic and large private fertility centers in the United States. And we also partnered with other innovative companies who care about women's health, like 23andMe, one of the largest consumer genetic testing companies, Ferran Pharmaceuticals. I'll tell you about that partnership in a moment. And we've just started our ex-US partnerships by partnering with the UK Biobank. The other thing that we did was we started to go directly to women to try to empower women to directly contribute their data to try to move the evidence base forward. Together with 23andMe, we launched a fertility research community. And our goal was to enroll 4,500 women. 23andMe estimated, based off of other studies they had helped companies with, that it could take 2 years to recruit 4,500 women for a prospective study across 18 months to try to understand over that period of time who got pregnant, who didn't, who ended up with a pregnancy complication, et cetera. So we announced the study on social media. We didn't spend $1 on advertising. And in a week, 23andMe called and said we had to take the site offline because we are oversubscribed by 2x. So we had over 1,000 women a day signed up for this study for virtually no compensation. It probably helped that Trump had just been elected, so I thank you, President Trump. But I think that there was a wake-up call with women that if they want to be studied, they have to contribute to these studies, and it's just been amazing to see how eager women have been to share their data and be involved. And then finally, when you're building these large foundational data assets, you also have to like the Cancer Genome Atlas and some of the other models that we have at the NIH, you have to start putting this data together. You have to harmonize it. You have to make sure that at different collection sites, different initiatives, different cohorts, different data sources, you can actually do studies across these different data sources. So we've done a lot of work on database development and design and thinking a lot about how you bring data together. And so our platform that powers this is called Reproductive Atlas. I'm happy to tell you guys more about that later. But one of the data sets that's also powering Reproductive Atlas was a really ambitious annotation effort, because what we said was, even though that line looked really small, the yellow one, there were papers. There were thousands of papers that had been funded, and certainly others were doing this work around the world. So one of the things that we realized is that PubMed is basically a large, useless, unstructured data set. We structured PubMed, and we started with AI algorithms. We informatically edited the 24 million papers in PubMed down to about 22,000 that we then manually curated. So those are PhD postdoc level scientists who actually manually went through every single one of these papers, read the references to find the false negatives, and edited out the false positives. Then our bioinformatics team mapped how many unique genomic loci were described in these papers, and found that as of when I showed this slide, so as of the end of 2015, and this number has grown subsequently, there were 1,800 different gene diagnosis combinations in reproductive health that had been studied clinically. We applied a framework called the ClinGen framework to ranking this evidence base, and we found at the end of this that 32 genes related to women's reproductive health had been well studied enough across multiple cohorts that in oncology they would be used in clinical care already. And it was really surprising to us, because we assumed that these genetic markers were not being used to screen for risk and to help drive subclinical insights in reproductive health for women, because the evidence base wasn't there. And it turned out that it was, just nobody was using it. So the next challenge was, how do you actually build a business around this? Because ultimately, we're not trying to create our own little mini academic group. So we had to have a business model. And so the business models that we have developed over time at Celmatix, one was that we took this data that we had from electronic medical records, so real-world evidence, and we built technology tools to allow infertility doctors to counsel patients with support from a technology platform called Polaris, so allowed them to counsel them in a more personalized way. This year, we also launched a consumer-facing version of it. It's myfertilitycompass.io, if any of you guys want to go and explore your data and what it means about your reproductive health. And then finally, this took 8 years, but we took that genomic insight and took it through regulatory approval and launched the first multi-gene panel test for risk of reproductive conditions in women, the Fertilome test. We got approval for that in November. It's now been used with over 1,000 women. And what's amazing is that just a few months into really the precision medicine era in our field, which was the original vision for the company, there are 3 unique protocols that have emerged to pair this genomic insight with interventions, and women are able to now achieve pregnancies who were unable to achieve pregnancies before. And it's really just the baby days of precision medicine in our field. And then finally, the last business model that's emerged from this, and really companies like 23andMe and Flatiron Health and Foundation Medicine pioneered this, is that the data that's powering these provider and patient-facing and consumer-facing tools is extremely valuable to pharmaceutical companies who want to better understand who they should be targeting, at what doses, and also what they should be investing in for their pipelines to come. And so we just announced our first pharmaceutical partnership with Ferran Pharmaceuticals, based out of Switzerland, to do the first real pharmacogenomic study at the FDA in our field, which is really exciting. So I will leave you there, and I will close with what I think will be the next chapter for Celmatix and for the field, which is that hopefully these genomic level insights, now that they are, physicians are seeing, one of the physicians described it as a new language. It was like he developed a new sense. He was seeing a patient in a completely different way, seeing them by molecularly what was going on with them. We think that this is also going to inspire the next generation of targeted interventions so that we can move further down those signaling pathways in endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, menopause transition, et cetera. So I think I went a minute over. I'm good? Right on time? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions submitted by the audience. So the first is, quality of IVF has drastically improved over the last 10 years, but the cost has continued to remain a huge barrier, despite many millennials being willing to try it. How do you foresee this changing over time, or how do you think this currently impacts the field?
Yes, so I heard a statistic at the last American Society for Reproductive Medicine meeting in Denver a couple weeks ago that up to 40% of the current REI population in the US may be up for retirement soon. So the problem is only going to get worse and not better. And there are a number of really innovative models now. One of the things that I've heard that I think will help a little bit is that OBGYN training will potentially expand to include more fertility care so that we can really increase access, because there are many OBGYNs, and it just makes sense that they should be helping women more proactively manage their fertility and some of their fertility difficulties. So I think that OBGYNs will step up a little bit, and probably the training programs will evolve to reflect that. And I really believe that data is key to helping us optimize every dollar and every minute of an REI's time, every dollar that's spent and every minute of the physician's time. And it's one of the things that we've seen with our Polaris platform is that patients, in better understanding their personal metrics, are getting directed more quickly and more efficiently to the interventions that are going to help them build their family. So I think those are probably the biggest drivers in the years to come that will help address access.
Thank you. And just one last question. How do you view the pros and cons of trying to establish your company in a space that traditionally gets minimal funding in comparison to other areas, as you mentioned? What have been some of the unexpected positives of this, and what have been some challenges you faced in acquiring funding, securing your niche?
Sure. So I'll start with the non-obvious one, which is the upside of being in an underfunded zone, which is that there's a lot of white space. So it's a little bit like the analogy that I've used with physicians and collaborators in the field is there's a reason why small European countries have amazing health systems. You have white space, it's a relatively small population of stakeholders. You can create a great idea and then implement it. America is huge and messy. It's very hard. There are legacy systems. I see oncology that way too. Oncology, there's been $1 trillion invested around the world. There are so many stakeholders. There are so many legacy systems. You can't just walk into oncology with a new playbook and say, here's the plan, all of oncology, here's what we're going to do. The good news for reproductive health is it is such a small community. There were no legacy systems, or very few of them, a few specialty electronic medical record systems, et cetera. So what we were able to do was, what I saw happen in oncology is it was a startup. They had to build the airplane as it was taking off for precision medicine. By bringing precision medicine into a field almost 2 decades into the precision medicine revolution in general, we were able to leverage those technologies, those insights, those best practices, what worked, what didn't, and build it from scratch. So that's really been a positive, and though it was harder, ultimately I think reproductive health could very quickly eclipse other fields of medicine. Women's health, ditto, could very quickly eclipse, and I think part of it is that people are so motivated, they are so appreciative because they have been underserved for so long. So I think that's one thing. On the challenges side, I don't think this is new to anybody, but I'll share some of the stats. So 2% of all VC funding goes to females. It's pretty depressing. I knew it was hard to fundraise. I assumed it was me. I assumed it was that I was a first-time entrepreneur, maybe that I was innovating in a frontier space like women's health. But the reality is that there are just really structural barriers, and a lot of people have opined on this. I don't think I have a whole lot to add to the conversation. But it made me realize that I needed to step up to the plate, do more things like this, come out and talk to people, help make it clear that it can be done. I had 3 children in 6 years while building this company, and breastfed all 3 of them, had the privilege of doing that. It hasn't been easy, but I did it. And I remember that I used to try to minimize or hide it. There was a video, I tried to wear a loose shirt so I wouldn't look pregnant in the video. And I've thrown all of that out the window now. I'm happy to be pregnant in virtually every picture if you Google me online. It's important. It's important to not be in the closet about this stuff. I think the F Word campaign really inspired me to be more outspoken about this stuff. But the reality is it is hard. And I had this conversation yesterday with a VC who said, "Oh, we've started this amazing organization. We're going to have equity. We're going to have 50-50." And I said, "You know, it's going to be this is multi-generational. Let's define success in a realistic way, because you can't just fund a lot of women. You have to address some of the structural societal barriers." I was very lucky. I'm not the breadwinner in my home, so I was able to build a team at home to help support me to be at work. A lot of women don't have that. And so I think until we have daycare and maternity leave and breastfeeding support and all those things for women, I don't think we'll ever really have parity. But I think we can do a whole lot better than we're doing right now. So anyway, so I'm trying to be part of the solution. So for any of the females or males, quite frankly, in the audience, if there's anything I can do to help you guys, to support women in your organizations, to help you in general, I really would love to give back. So let me know how I can help.
Thank you so much.
Future of Care is New York City's premier community for healthcare innovation. To learn more, subscribe to our channel and visit our website at futureofcare.nyc.